November cold cuts through everything. 2 a.m. A bus stop with no shelter, no light, just the orange flicker of a dying street lamp. And there she was, an old woman sitting alone on the bench, a white cane resting against her knee, a worn fabric suitcase beside her, the kind nobody carries anymore unless they have nothing else left. David had just finished a 12-hour shift. His eyes burned. His body screamed for sleep, but something made him stop. Something about the way she sat, spine perfectly straight, chin lifted, as if she were waiting in a boardroom, not freezing on a roadside. A blind old woman alone in the middle of the night and a weary single man. Would this moment break him open through yet another brush with poverty and loss? Or would it quietly add one more soul like his to the long list of people he carried with him? David Miller pulled his Honda Civic to the curb and cut the engine. The heater died with a tired wheeze, and cold immediately crept through the gaps in the door seals. He sat there for a moment, watching the woman through the windshield. She hadn't moved, hadn't turned toward the sound of his car. Her face was tilted slightly upward, as if she were listening to something far away or maybe just waiting for something that wasn't coming. He grabbed his jacket from the passenger seat and stepped out. The cold hit him like a wall. His breath came out in white clouds as he crossed the empty street. The street lamp above the bus stop flickered twice, casting orange shadows across the cracked concrete. "Ma'am?" He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to startle her. "Are you all right?" She turned her head toward his voice. Her eyes didn't focus on him, they looked past him, through him, into some middle distance that didn't exist. Blind, completely blind. "I'm fine, thank you." Her voice was calm, measured, the kind of voice that expected to be listened to. "My son said he would come. I suppose he's running late." David glanced at his watch. 2:14 a.m. The last bus had stopped running hours ago. The temperature had dropped below freezing. And this woman, 65, maybe 70, was sitting here in a thin wool coat that wouldn't keep a dog warm. "How long have you been waiting?" She considered the question as if it required careful thought. "A few hours, perhaps. Time moves differently when you can't see. A few hours." In this cold, David felt something tighten in his chest, not pity, exactly, but something closer to anger. Anger at whoever had left her here. Anger at a world that let this happen. "Ma'am, I don't think anyone's coming." The buses stopped at midnight. "There's nothing out here." "I know," she said it simply, without self-pity. "I know." David pulled out his phone and called the non-emergency line. He explained the situation, asked about shelters, about social services, about anywhere this woman could go tonight. The answer came back flat and bureaucratic. All shelters were full. Social services opened at 8 a.m., and there was nothing anyone could do until morning. He hung up and looked at her again. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, as if she had all the time in the world, as if freezing to death on a bus stop bench was just another thing to be endured. "Ma'am, my name is David Miller. I'm a paramedic. I live about 10 minutes from here." He paused, knowing how this would sound. "I have a spare room. You're welcome to stay the night. In the morning, I can help you figure out what to do next." She didn't respond immediately. He watched her face, the slight furrow of her brow, the way her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the handle of her cane. "That's very kind," she said finally. "But you don't know me." "No, ma'am, I don't. But I know you'll freeze out here, and I can't drive away knowing that." Another long pause. Then she nodded, just once, and reached for her suitcase. "My name is Margaret," she said. "Margaret Ashford." David took the suitcase lighter than he expected, as if it held almost nothing, and helped her to her feet. Her hand trembled in his, but her grip was firm, deliberate, and when she walked, she moved with a careful precision that spoke of someone who had learned to navigate darkness but hadn't surrendered to it. He opened the passenger door and guided her in, one hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching. She settled into the seat and buckled herself in without assistance, her fingers finding the clasp by memory. They drove in silence. David kept the heat running high, watching from the corner of his eye as color slowly returned to her face. She sat with her hands folded, staring straight ahead at nothing, and he found himself wondering who she was, who she had been, because there was something about her, the way she held herself, the way she spoke, that didn't match the worn suitcase and the thin coat. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. The elevator was broken again, so he carried her suitcase up the stairs while she climbed slowly, one hand on the railing, the other holding her cane. She didn't complain, didn't ask for help, just climbed, steady and deliberate, until they reached his door. Inside, the apartment was small but clean. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that opened into a living room, walls decorated with Sophie's drawings and a few framed photos. David set the suitcase by the couch and turned on a lamp. "The spare room is down the hall," he said. "Bathroom's next to it. I'll get you some blankets." "Thank you, David." She stood in the middle of the living room, her cane tapping lightly against the floor as she oriented herself. "You have a child." It wasn't a question. David paused. "How did you know? The apartment smells like crayons and cereal, and there's a drawing on your refrigerator. I can hear the paper rustling from the vent." He almost smiled. "My daughter, Sophie. She's 9. She's asleep." Margaret nodded slowly. "You're raising her alone." Again, not a question. David didn't answer, but she seemed to take his silence as confirmation. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That's not an easy path." He showed her to the spare room and brought extra blankets. Before he left, she called his name. "David." She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her cane leaning against the nightstand. "Why did you stop? Most people would have driven past." He thought about it. Thought about Elena, about the cancer that took her, about all the times he'd wished anyone had been there when it mattered. "Because someone should have," he said. "Good night, Mrs. Ashford." He closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. Then he went to check on Sophie, who was sleeping peacefully, her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. He watched her breathe for a while. Then he went to bed. He didn't sleep well. Something about the woman kept nagging at him, something he couldn't name. Morning came gray and cold. David was up at 5:30, moving quietly through the kitchen, starting coffee, pulling out bread for toast. His body ran on autopilot. 12-hour night shifts had trained him to function on fragments of sleep. Sophie emerged at 6:15, still in her pajamas, hair a tangled mess. She stopped in the doorway when she saw the suitcase by the couch. "Dad? Whose is that?" "We have a guest," David said, keeping his voice low. "An older woman. I found her stranded last night. She's staying in the spare room." Sophie processed this with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who had learned that life sometimes brought strangers to their door. Her father was a paramedic. Unexpected things happened. "Is she okay?" "She's fine. Just needed a place to stay." Sophie nodded and climbed onto her usual stool at the kitchen counter. David set a bowl of cereal in front of her and poured himself more coffee. They had a routine. The two of them, a rhythm built over 4 years of figuring out how to be a family of 2. "Remember the rules," David said, as he did every morning. Sophie rolled her eyes but recited them anyway. "Be kind. Be honest. Stand up for what's right. Good girl." She was halfway through her cereal when Margaret appeared in the doorway. She moved slowly, one hand trailing along the wall, the other holding her cane. She'd changed into different clothes from her suitcase, still worn, still old, but clean. "Good morning," David said. "Coffee? Please." Margaret made her way to the table, navigating by sound and touch. Sophie watched her with open curiosity. "You're blind," Sophie said. "Sophie," David started. "It's all right." Margaret settled into a chair, her hands finding the edges of the table. "Yes, I am. I lost my sight about 18 months ago. Does it hurt?" "Not anymore. Now it's just dark." Sophie considered this. "I'm Sophie." "Hello, Sophie. I'm Margaret. Thank you for letting me stay in your home." David poured coffee and set it in front of Margaret, placing her hand gently on the mug so she'd know where it was. She wrapped her fingers around it, absorbing the warmth. "I called some shelters this morning," David said. "There's space opening up this afternoon. I can drive you." That won't be necessary. Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. I'll make other arrangements. Mrs. Ashford, with respect, what arrangements? You don't have a phone. You said your son was supposed to pick you up, but he didn't come. Is there someone else I can call? She didn't answer. Her fingers tightened around the mug. Sophie was watching Margaret with that intense focus children have when they sense something adults are missing. She put down her spoon. Dad, can I use your laptop? I need to look something up for school. David glanced at the clock. Make it quick. Bus comes in 20 minutes. Sophie slid off her stool and disappeared into the living room. David heard the laptop open, heard her fingers tapping on the keys. He turned back to Margaret. Mrs. Ashford, I want to help, but I can't help if I don't know what's going on. Margaret was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was different, heavier, older. Sometimes, David, help isn't possible. Sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones who... She stopped, shook her head. Forgive me, I'm tired. I'm not thinking clearly. Before David could respond, Sophie came running back into the kitchen. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. Dad! She held up the laptop, screen facing him. Dad, look! David took the laptop. On the screen was a news article from 18 months ago, with a photo of a silver-haired woman standing at a podium, the logo of Ashford Medical Technologies behind her. The headline read, Ashford Medical founder injured in fatal crash, grandson named acting CEO. The woman in the photo was younger, her eyes sharp and focused. But the face was the same. The posture was the same. David looked at Margaret. She sat motionless, her hands still wrapped around the coffee mug, her expression unreadable. You're Margaret Ashford, he said slowly. The Margaret Ashford, founder of Ashford Medical Technologies. She didn't deny it. Sophie was already reading from another article, her voice high with excitement. Dad, it says her company is worth $3 billion. She invented medical devices. She's famous. Was, Margaret said quietly. I was those things. David set the laptop down. His mind was racing, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him in her worn clothes, with her battered suitcase with the titan of industry described in these articles. I don't understand, he said. If you're Margaret Ashford, why were you alone at a bus stop at 2 a.m? Why don't you have a phone? Why? Because I'm a prisoner. Margaret's voice was flat. Final. A legal prisoner. My nephew, the son I mentioned, has had me declared incompetent. He controls my money, my medical care, my movements, everything. She laughed, a bitter sound. The nursing home they put me in costs $800 a month. My company is worth $3 billion, and they put me in a facility that smells like bleach and resignation. Sophie had gone very still. That's not fair. No, Margaret agreed. It isn't. David sat down heavily. He thought about the conservatorship cases he'd read about elderly people declared unfit by family members who wanted their money. He'd always assumed those were rare. Exceptions, not something that could happen to someone like this. Your nephew, he said. He just took everything? Vincent has good lawyers. Expensive lawyers. They found 3 doctors, willing to say I had cognitive decline from the accident. They filed papers. A judge signed off. And just like that, she snapped her fingers. A sharp sound in the quiet kitchen. I stopped being a person and became a ward. But you're not. David struggled for words. You're clearly not incompetent. You remember everything. You're articulate. I'm blind and old and alone. Margaret's voice was gentle, as if explaining something obvious to a child. That's all they needed. Sophie climbed off her stool and walked over to Margaret. Without a word, she took the old woman's hand. We won't let them take you back, Sophie said. Margaret's composure cracked just for a moment. Her chin trembled. She squeezed Sophie's hand. Sweet girl, she whispered. Some battles can't be won. David watched his daughter holding hands with a billionaire who had lost everything, and he felt something shift inside him, something that had been dormant since Elena died. Tell me everything, he said. From the beginning, The story took 2 hours to tell. Margaret spoke in that same measured voice, but now David could hear the exhaustion beneath it, the weight of 18 months of fighting a battle no one knew she was fighting. The accident had been in April of the previous year. She and Robert, her husband, co-founder, partner of 43 years, were driving home from a dinner with investors. A truck ran a red light. Robert died at the scene. Margaret survived but lost her vision entirely, damage to the occipital lobe that no surgery could repair. Vincent came to see her every day in the hospital. Her nephew, whom she'd raised after his mother died, whom she'd groomed to eventually take over the company. He held her hand, brought her flowers, told her everything would be fine. 3 months later, she was declared incompetent. The doctor's reports were convincing on paper. Cognitive decline, confusion, inability to manage her own affairs. Margaret hadn't even known about the court hearing until it was over. By the time she understood what had happened, Vincent had control of everything. Her finances, her healthcare decisions, her freedom. They moved her from the hospital to Sunrise Care Facility, a nursing home 40 minutes outside the city. Her phone was taken for her safety. Her laptop was removed because screens would strain her non-functional eyes. Visitors had to be approved by Vincent, and somehow, no one ever got approved. For 18 months, she'd lived in a 10 by 12 room, eating institutional food, listening to the television in the common area, waiting for someone to remember she existed. "How did you get out?" David asked. "There was a new aide, young woman, just started. I told her my family was coming to pick me up for a birthday dinner." Margaret's lips curved in a mirthless smile. She believed me. She even helped me pack. And then no one came. No one came. I walked to the bus stop. I didn't know where else to go. David was quiet for a long moment. Sophie had gone to school reluctantly, looking back at Margaret 3 times before finally getting on the bus. Now it was just the two of them, sitting in his small kitchen, the winter light gray through the windows. "The conservatorship," David said. "Can it be challenged? With money and lawyers?" "Yes. But Vincent controls my money. And the lawyers I used to trust." She shook her head. "They work for him now. There has to be something. Evidence that you're competent. Medical records." "David." Margaret reached across the table, her hand finding his arm with surprising accuracy. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you don't understand what you'd be fighting. Vincent has resources. Connections. Lawyers who bill $800 an hour. You're a paramedic with a 9-year-old daughter. This isn't your battle. Maybe not." David looked at her hand on his arm, thin, lined with age, but steady. "But I've been a paramedic for 12 years, Mrs. Ashford. I've seen a lot of people get hurt, and I've learned that sometimes the worst injuries aren't the ones you can see." She was silent. "I'm not a lawyer," David continued. "I'm not rich, but I know people. I know a doctor at St. Joseph's who owes me a favor. If we can get an independent evaluation, a real one, not paid for by Vincent, that proves you're competent, it won't be enough. Vincent has 3 evaluations, 3 doctors. Then we need to be smarter than him." David leaned forward. "Mrs. Ashford, you built a $3 billion company from nothing. You're telling me you can't outsmart one nephew?" For the first time, something like fire flickered in Margaret's blind eyes. "I used to eat men like Vincent for breakfast," she said quietly. Before doesn't matter. What matters is now." Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "There's something you should know," she said. "Something I haven't told you." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small object. A USB drive, barely bigger than her thumbnail. "I hid this in my suitcase. In the lining. Vincent's people searched my things, but they didn't think to check there." She held it out. "It's recordings, audio files. Everything I could remember, everything I observed, for the first 6 months after the accident. Dates, names, conversations I overheard." David took the drive. It was warm from her body heat. "Why didn't you use this before?" "Use it how? Send it to the police? The courts? I'm legally incompetent, David. Anything I produce is considered the ramblings of a confused old woman. Vincent's lawyers would have it thrown out in an hour. Then why keep it? Margaret smiled a real smile, tired but genuine, because I'm not dead yet. And I learned a long time ago. Always keep records. You never know when the tide will turn. David looked at the USB drive in his hand. Such a small thing to hold so much. I need to make some calls, he said. Can you stay here today? Don't answer the door for anyone. Where are you going? To find out how deep this goes. The call from Vincent Ashford came 2 days later. David was at work halfway through a shift at Street Joseph's, restocking the ambulance after a cardiac call when his phone buzzed. The voice on the other end was smooth, cultured, and completely devoid of warmth. Mr. Miller? This is Vincent Ashford. I believe you have something that belongs to me. David stepped away from the ambulance, his heart rate climbing. I don't know what you're talking about. My aunt, Mr. Miller. She's a very sick woman. She wandered away from her care facility, and we've been worried sick about her. Vincent's voice dripped with false concern. The police have been notified. Imagine my relief when I learned she'd been found safe. How did you get this number? I have resources, Mr. Miller, as I'm sure you're beginning to understand. A pause. I'd like to come pick her up. Say, tomorrow morning? I'll bring the proper documentation, of course. Guardianship papers, medical orders, everything above board. David's hand tightened on the phone. And if I say no, then I'll have to involve the authorities. You're currently harboring a legally incompetent person without authorization from her guardian. That's a crime, Mr. Miller. I'd hate for your daughter to see her father arrested. The threat hung in the air like smoke. I'll be there at 9, Vincent said. Please have her ready. The line went dead. David didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table, listening to the recordings on Margaret's USB drive, making notes. The files were exactly what Margaret had described. Clear, coherent, detailed. Dates and times. Conversations she'd overheard between Vincent and his lawyers. The names of the doctors who had signed off on her incompetency evaluation. Financial transactions she'd been asked to approve but never understood. It was damning. But Margaret was right in court. Without independent verification, it would be dismissed as the confused memories of an incompetent woman. He needed something else, something that couldn't be explained away. At 3 a.m., he found it. It was a recording from 6 months after the accident. Margaret's voice, describing a conversation she'd overheard between Vincent and someone named Reynolds, the family lawyer. Vincent said he needed the conservatorship extended indefinitely. Reynolds asked about the board. Vincent laughed and said, "The board thinks she has dementia. They'll believe whatever I tell them." Then Reynolds asked about the emails. Vincent said, "I've been sending correspondence in her name for months. No one can tell the difference." Emails. Vincent had been forging emails in Margaret's name. If David could prove that, if he could show that official communications had been sent without Margaret's knowledge or consent, that was fraud. That was something even Vincent's lawyers couldn't explain away. But how? He was a paramedic, not a detective. He didn't have access to Margaret's company emails. He didn't have... His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I worked with Margaret for 32 years. I know what Vincent is doing. Can we talk?" David stared at the message. Then he typed back, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "Eleanor Vance, former CFO. I've been waiting for someone to listen." Vincent Ashford arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, exactly as promised. David watched through the window as a black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. Vincent emerged first tall, impeccably dressed in a gray suit that probably cost more than David made in a month. Behind him came 2 other men, one in a similar suit, carrying a briefcase, and one who was clearly security, thick-necked and watchful. Sophie was at school. Margaret was in the spare room, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't spoken much that morning. There was a resignation in her posture that made David's chest ache. He opened the door before Vincent could knock. "Mr. Miller." Vincent smiled a politician's smile, all teeth and no warmth. "Thank you for taking care of my aunt. I can't tell you how worried we've been. I'm sure you have. Vincent's smile flickered, just for a moment. May I come in? David stepped aside. Vincent entered, his eyes sweeping the apartment with barely concealed disdain, the worn furniture, the crayon drawings on the refrigerator, the coffee mug with a chip in the rim. The lawyer followed, but the security guard stayed outside. Where is she? Vincent asked. Down the hall. But before you see her, we need to talk. There's nothing to talk about, Mr. Miller. I have legal guardianship. I have documentation. He gestured to the lawyer, who opened his briefcase and produced a thick folder. Everything is in order. I'm sure it is. David didn't move. Your lawyers are very thorough, almost as thorough as you've been, sending emails in Margaret's name without her knowledge. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Vincent's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a calculation, a reassessment. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. I think you've been forging correspondence for over a year. I think you've been making decisions, business decisions, legal decisions, and signing Margaret's name to them without her consent. David kept his voice calm, even. I think that's fraud. The lawyer stepped forward. Mr. Miller, these are serious allegations. I hope you have evidence to support them, because otherwise you're looking at a defamation suit that will... I have recordings. Margaret kept detailed notes of everything she heard for the first 6 months, including a conversation between Mr. Ashford and someone named Reynolds about sending emails in her name. Vincent's jaw tightened. Those recordings are inadmissible, the lawyer said quickly. Mrs. Ashford is legally incompetent. Anything she produced, maybe in court. But I'm not talking about court. David smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. I'm talking about the board of directors. I'm talking about shareholders. I'm talking about the Wall Street Journal, which I'm sure would be very interested in a story about corporate fraud at a $3 billion medical device company. Silence. Vincent stared at David with undisguised hatred. You're bluffing. Try me. The standoff lasted 10 seconds. 20. Then Vincent's lawyer whispered something in his ear, and Vincent's expression shifted from anger to something colder, more calculating. What do you want, Mr. Miller? I want an independent medical evaluation, not your doctors, a neutral third party, a panel of neurologists with no connection to you, your company, or your lawyers. And if my aunt fails this evaluation, then I'll accept the results. But if she passes, if she proves she's competent, you drop the conservatorship. Immediately. Vincent was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed, a short, humorless sound. You're either very brave or very stupid, Mr. Miller. I haven't decided which. He adjusted his cuffs. Fine. You'll have your evaluation. But when it confirms what we already know, that my aunt is a confused, delusional old woman, I'll be back. And I won't be as polite. He turned and walked out, his lawyer hurrying behind him. The door slammed shut. David stood in the silence, his heart pounding. From the hallway, Margaret's voice. That was quite a performance, David. He turned. She was standing in the bedroom doorway, her cane in hand, her blind eyes fixed on approximately where he was standing. You heard? Every word. She walked toward him slowly, her hand finding the back of a chair. You know he'll rig the evaluation. I know. And you did it anyway. I bought us time. That's all. He ran a hand through his hair. I got a message last night from someone named Eleanor Vance. She says she has information. Margaret went still. Eleanor? She contacted you? You know her? She was my CFO for 32 years. My closest friend in the company. Margaret's voice was thick with emotion. I thought she'd abandoned me. Like everyone else. She says she's been waiting for someone to listen. For the first time since David had met her, Margaret smiled, a real smile, bright and fierce. Then perhaps, she said. The game isn't over yet. The next 3 weeks were a blur. Eleanor Vance turned out to be a 71-year-old woman with steel gray hair, reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose, and a memory like a filing cabinet. She'd kept copies of everything, emails, memos, board meeting minutes going back years. When Vincent had pushed her into early retirement, she'd taken her records with her. "I always knew something would happen," she told David over coffee in his cramped kitchen. "Margaret built that company from nothing." Vincent was always jealous, always waiting for his chance. The medical evaluation happened 10 days after Vincent's visit. True to form, Vincent tried to stack the deck, suggesting doctors, proposing facilities, attempting to control every variable. But David had anticipated this. Through Eleanor's contacts, they'd arranged for the evaluation to be conducted by a panel of 3 independent neurologists from 3 different states, none of whom had any connection to Ashford Medical Technologies. Margaret passed with flying colors. The evaluation was unanimous. Complete cognitive function, no signs of dementia, no evidence of the severe decline described in Vincent's doctor's reports. But that was just the beginning. Armed with the evaluation, Eleanor began reaching out to board members she'd worked with for decades. Many of them had wondered about Margaret's sudden disappearance from public life. Some had asked questions, only to be assured by Vincent that his aunt was comfortable and well cared for. They were horrified to learn the truth. Meanwhile, David dug into the email records Eleanor had preserved. What he found was worse than he'd imagined. Over 18 months, Vincent had sent hundreds of emails in Margaret's name, approving acquisitions, signing off on personnel decisions, endorsing strategic directions she'd never seen. Each one was a potential count of fraud. The case was building. But it wasn't enough to just prove Vincent was corrupt. They needed to restore Margaret's voice, literally. They needed to give her a platform where she could speak for herself, where the whole world could see that she was anything but incompetent. And there was only one place to do that. The annual shareholders' meeting of Ashford Medical Technologies was held on the first Thursday of December, in the company's downtown headquarters, a 40-story glass tower that Margaret had helped design 30 years ago. David had never been inside a building like this. The lobby alone was bigger than his entire apartment complex, all marble floors and soaring ceilings and people in suits that cost more than his car. He felt out of place in his paramedic uniform, the only formal clothes he owned that weren't wrinkled. But the uniform served a purpose. Security barely glanced at him as he pushed Margaret's wheelchair through the service entrance. Just another medical escort. Nothing to see. Sophie walked beside them, clutching an iPad to her chest. She'd insisted on coming. "I'm part of this too, Dad. You can't leave me out." He couldn't argue with that. Eleanor met them on the 35th floor, near the executive elevators. Her face was tight with tension. "Vincent knows something's happening," she said quietly. "Security has been doubled. The board members I contacted have been getting calls, pressure to stay away." "And?" Eleanor smiled grimly. "They came anyway. Thomas Wright, Jennifer Huang, Marcus Blake, they're all inside. They want to hear Margaret speak." The conference hall was enormous, easily 300 people, shareholders and executives and media, all gathered for the annual review of company performance. Vincent stood at the podium, mid-sentence, his face projected on massive screens behind him. Then the doors opened, and Margaret Ashford wheeled in. The room went silent. Vincent's face froze. For one perfect moment, his mask slipped, and David saw what was underneath. Fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the silent room, "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe I have the floor." What followed would later be described as one of the most dramatic corporate confrontations in American business history. Margaret spoke for 47 minutes. She didn't need notes. Her memory, honed by decades of board meetings and investor calls, was flawless. She named every board member in the room, recited project timelines and budget figures, quoted from strategic plans that Vincent had claimed she'd approved but had never seen. When Vincent's lawyers tried to intervene, citing her conservatorship, her documented cognitive decline, Margaret simply smiled. "I have 3 independent neurological evaluations conducted last week," she said. "All 3 conclude that I have no cognitive impairment whatsoever. Would you like me to read the relevant passages? I have them memorized." Sophie stepped forward with the iPad. The audio recordings played through the room's speaker system. Margaret's clear voice, documenting everything Vincent had done. The emails, the forged signatures, the doctors who had been paid to lie. Vincent tried to fight, tried to claim the recordings were fabricated, that Margaret was delusional, that this was all a misunderstanding. But the shareholders were already murmuring among themselves, and the board members Eleanor had contacted were standing, demanding answers. The vote of no confidence was unanimous. Vincent Ashford was removed as CEO before the market closed that day. The aftermath unfolded quickly. The board appointed an independent committee to investigate Vincent's conduct. Within weeks, they uncovered more than anyone had expected. Falsified expense reports, unauthorized loans to personal accounts, and a pattern of intimidation against employees who asked too many questions. Vincent's lawyers negotiated a plea deal to avoid criminal prosecution. He surrendered all claims to the company, repaid the misappropriated funds, and agreed to a restraining order that prohibited any contact with Margaret. The conservatorship was dissolved by the same court that had granted it, with a note from the judge expressing deep concern about how easily the system had been manipulated. Margaret returned to Ashford Medical Technologies as chairman of the board, not CEO. Her choice. "I'm 70 years old and blind," she told the press. "I don't need to run everything. I just need to make sure it's run right." Her first act was to establish a new division focused on accessibility technology. Her second was to create a foundation to help other elderly people trapped in abusive conservatorships. She called it the Robert Ashford Foundation, after her late husband. "He always said the measure of a company is how it treats the people who can't fight back," she explained in an interview. "I forgot that for a while. I won't forget again." David watched the interview from his couch. Sophie asleep beside him. On the screen, Margaret sat straight-backed in a leather chair, her guide dog Oscar at her feet, answering questions with the same calm precision she'd shown that first night at the bus stop. She'd mentioned him once, briefly, a paramedic who saw an old woman in trouble and chose to help. No name, no details, just that. He was grateful for the anonymity. He didn't want attention. He just wanted his life back, his shifts at the hospital, his mornings with Sophie, his quiet evenings, reading or watching TV. But something had changed. He could feel it. For years after Elena's death, he'd been going through the motions. Wake up, go to work, take care of Sophie, sleep, repeat. He'd told himself it was enough. He'd told himself that survival was the same as living. It wasn't. Margaret had reminded him of that. Standing up for something even when you might lose, even when the odds were impossible, that was what made life worth living. That was what he wanted to teach Sophie. 6 months later, on a warm spring evening, 3 people sat at a small table in the Ashford Medical Technologies cafeteria. The room had been renovated since Margaret's return, brighter lighting, more accessible layouts, braille labels on every surface. Part of her new initiative to make the company a leader in inclusive design. David still felt out of place here. He wasn't a businessman. He wasn't rich. He was just a paramedic who'd stopped at a bus stop on a cold night because leaving an old woman alone felt wrong. But Margaret had insisted on these weekly dinners. Family dinners, she called them, though they weren't family by blood. Sophie was telling Margaret about her school project, something about marine biology, which Margaret seemed genuinely interested in. They had an easy rapport now, these two, the 9-year-old and the billionaire. They talked about everything. Science, books, the future. David watched them and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, maybe, or something close to it. "David." Margaret reached across the table, her hand finding his arm with practiced accuracy. "I never properly thanked you. You don't have to." "Yes, I do." She squeezed his arm. "You didn't have to stop that night. You didn't have to believe me. You didn't have to risk everything, your job, your custody of Sophie, your entire life for a stranger. You weren't a stranger. Not after that first night." Margaret smiled. "No, I suppose not." Sophie looked up from her project notes. "Dad says you taught him something important." "Did he?" Margaret's blind eyes crinkled. What was that? David thought about it. About Elena. about loss, about all the years he'd spent just surviving instead of living. "You taught me that doing the right thing isn't about winning," he said slowly. "It's about standing up, even when you might lose, even when it's hard." "I learned that from you," Margaret said quietly. "You reminded me what real strength looks like. Not money, not power, just showing up." Sophie reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "You're part of our family now. Dad says so." "Does he?" David nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "Yeah, I do." Margaret's composure cracked just for a moment. Her eyes glistened with tears she couldn't see but could still feel. "I'm honored," she whispered. "More than I can say." Outside, the sun was setting over the city, painting the glass tower in shades of gold and orange. In the distance, David could just make out the bus stop where he'd found Margaret 6 months ago, now renovated, with a shelter and a bench and a light that actually worked. Small changes, but they mattered. Sophie was talking again, something about whales, and Margaret was laughing a real laugh, warm and full. David listened to them and thought about all the things he couldn't control. The past, the future, the random cruelty of the world. But this moment, right here, 3 people who had found each other against all odds, sitting together in a cafeteria, sharing a meal, this he could hold on to. He picked up his coffee and took a sip. It was still warm. Outside, the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, one by one, pushing back the darkness.